My son Lane took me to a new movie by Kanye West in LA. And while I was there, there was a 45-second commercial before the film. And this advertisement was absolutely breathtaking. It showed in microfilm in the big surround sound screen in this LA theater, together with a surround sound kind of sound system, this wonderful little look at bubbles and fizzes. And it was like light was coming from within this liquid. It was Coca-Cola. And it was as if it was actually coming from the fountain of life. And as I watched this little advertisement, I thought, just 10 minutes ago, I was in the lobby, and I walked right by the fountain of life. But I did get popcorn, and it was pretty good. You know, one of the things that John tells us in our text is there is something that's really real. Advertisers want to share with us lots of things that will make us buy or make us invest. But as you read the book of John, he tells us about some amazing things that are the real thing. And he invites us to embrace that real thing, that God thing. And we have a description here in John's book about Jesus in chapter 9 about an amazing thing that happens following the Feast of the Tabernacle in Jerusalem. All the seasonal holiday lights at this point had been taken down. All the wonderful branches that had created tabernacles all around town had begun to wither and were placed out for the trash. But even though the holiday was over, Jesus was still on the move. And he comes walking by this beggar on the street. And the beggar does not see him because he's blind. And Jesus looks at him and sees him. And we're told that Jesus reaches out and touches him and heals him. And this man who was blind from birth begins to see. Now, we know from the description in our text that this is a supreme expression of Jesus' compassion. But even more than that, Jesus is being described by John here to show not only his compassion, but also to show his divinity and the unique power that Jesus has in order to have control over the darkness in someone's life and to bring light. It's a wonderful description of how Jesus makes a difference in this man's life. And this is one of 7 of the great signs that John presents that demonstrates the divine nature of Jesus. And sometimes in the various Gospels, Jesus is not ready for people to go and to know that he is one with the Heavenly Father and that he is on a mission to offer salvation and light and hope and help to the world. But here he really wants that message to be told. And so the way that he heals this man is very intimate and very personal and very deliberate. This man who cannot see can feel. And Jesus kneels down in the earth. He spits in the earth and he takes that mud that he creates and he places it on the man's eyes. Now, you know, spit is a pretty amazing thing. It can be used for lots of things. And Jesus uses it for healing here. But we all use spit for multiple things, don't we? You know it's true. Irma Bombeck says this about spit. She says, at first, it seems gross, but you soon adapt to how well it really works. It removes a milk stain from a bib. It removes lipstick kisses from the cheek. It removes chocolate from your lips. It removes bird dew and mud from the shoe. It removes ice cream from noses, spilled food from a shirt, and mothers need saliva, get this, you know it's true, to tame flyaway hair, especially that troublesome cowlick. It removes mustard from car seats. It gets fingerprints off of walls and doorknobs. It's very useful. Spit is a wonderful thing. Now, on a more scholarly, historic basis, the historian and Bible commentator William Barclay says that in the ancient world, doctors actually used spit for medicinal purposes. They thought of it as a cleansing thing. They also used leeches and other things. But here, the great physician, Jesus, plays the role of a doctor, and he kneels down and he does what doctors do, but in this case, he actually heals the person. This man who has never been able to see, who has been blind from birth, receives sight. And this is such a wonderful thing. And to understand the amazing dimension of this beautiful miracle, it's really helpful for us to see in the text where John places this story of the healing of this blind man. It comes right at the tail end of the tabernacle feast that we've talked about just a few moments ago. Now remember some of the great features of the tabernacle feast? One is the booths, which are a reminder of the tabernacle booth, that God would place the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, in when they were wandering in the desert. And so as the people lived in tents in the desert, and as the Ark of the Covenant was placed in a tabernacle, a tent, so too they had tabernacles all around. God was on the move and is still on the move. With the Feast of the Tabernacle, they also had one of the great symbols of water. And remember, I shared with you how Jesus shared the words about being living water. If anyone would thirst, let him come to him, for he provides living water. It was at the Feast of the Tabernacles, where they would daily walk down to the pool of Siloam and dip a golden pitcher into the pool, and then take that up to the Temple Mount and pour it at the base of the temple altar. And so water was a significant image, but so too was lights. In the city of Jerusalem, during the Feast of the Tabernacle, they would take lights and light up the entire Temple Mount, the 36 acres of the Temple Mount, and the priests would keep the oil burning at night. And all around the city of Jerusalem, people would look up at the Temple Mount, and they would see this glow, kind of like Times Square in New York City. It had that kind of impression on them. It's kind of like us, we have here in town the Feast of Lights at the U of R. And it's a very mystical, meaningful experience. We also have our candlelight service here on Christmas Eve. It's a very mystical, meaningful experience. One of those Methodist conference centers that I was telling you about last week is on Martha's Vineyard. And I was visiting there several years ago. And when I was there visiting some friends, they have all these little cute gingerbread Victorian cottages all around this town, surrounding the tabernacle in that town. And on one night, they call it the Night of Illumination. And that's a night when everybody that lives in one of those little gingerbread homes takes this beautiful Chinese lantern and places it outside of their house and with a light in it. And you walk around this village, and it's magical and mystical. And it really alters your kind of thinking. It gives you this whole different experience. You know that guy, Aldous Huxley, that wrote the book Doors to Perception? He talks about the idea of the Christian poet William Blake and how he describes the doors to perception that we gain. And he talks about these strange uses of expanding one's mind through things that are not good and rather dangerous. But in that book, this intellectual also shares that things like fireworks and campfires have a way of altering the mind and putting you in a different frame and perspective. And I think that's kind of what happens when you walk around Oak Bluff on Martha's Vineyard on the Night of Illumination. And you magnify that by 100. And that's what you got when you went to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem back in the day. They wanted to remind the people that God was going before all the ancient Hebrews when they were wandering in the wilderness, and he would go before them with a pillar of fire. And that's what they were reminded of. And so as they celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacle with all their marches and with all the trumpet horn blasts and with all the reciting of readings and with all the yelling and shouting and marching and lights, people were put in this magical, mystical mood. But that was now over. And they were back to life as usual. The beggars were out begging on the streets. The merchants were out hawking their wares. And Jesus comes by, and he sees this man who is blind from birth, and he heals him. And it's at that point that he says, I am the light of the world. And to make sure that everybody knows that this man has been healed, he sends him back down to that same pool of Siloam that they had spent time going to during the Feast of the Tabernacle in the 8 days prior during the celebration of the Tabernacle Feast. And while he's there, people see that he has been healed. And he makes a statement of witness for Christ. It's very fascinating how John, who tells his story, describes this intersection of two major themes that John repeats over and over again in his gospel account. The whole idea of water. Remember, it was the Spirit of God who hovered over the water in the beginning. And it was John the baptizer who baptized with water and who pointed to Jesus and said, I baptize with water, but he baptizes with the Holy Spirit. And Jesus talked to Nicodemus, and he talked to the Samaritan woman about the difference that a living water inside can make. And so now he sends this man who has been healed and no longer is in darkness down to the water. And he sees. Remember, it was John that said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We know from the book of Genesis that in the beginning, God said what? Let there be light. And Jesus is now saying he is the light of the world. He who was in the beginning hovering over the waters, he who was in the beginning saying, let there be light, is now working, intersecting in a significant way in the life of this one man. And there is a God moment here. This is a God thing. And we're talking about the real thing. Jesus wants us to know that. And John tells this story so that we might reflect on ways that God is at work in our life. Jesus is doing things. And how are we responding? How well do we see what God is at work doing in and around us? How can we let Jesus open our eyes? And what can we do to better recognize what God is doing in and among us? I think M. Scott Peck has a wonderful statement to this point. He writes this: listen, the person with a secular mentality feels himself to be the center of the universe, yet he is likely to suffer from a sense of meaninglessness and insignificance because he knows he's but one human among billions, all feeling themselves to be the center of things, scratching out an existence on the surface of a medium-sized planet, circling a small star among countless stars in a galaxy lost among countless galaxies. The person with a sacred mentality, on the other hand, does not feel herself to be the center of the universe. She considers the center to be elsewhere and other. Yet, she is unlikely to feel lost or insignificant precisely because she draws her significance and meaning from her relationship, from her connection with that center, with that other. It seems to me that having a spiritual insight to set ourselves aside so that we're not the center of our trip through time, but that God is the driving light and the flowing water is what really gives us meaning and purpose and direction. And one of the greatest gifts that God gives us for really coming into a meaningful relationship with who He is and what He's doing is the gift of Sabbath. Did you know that? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. This is our Christian Sabbath, the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection. And some of the people who saw this blind man healed, they made a big issue about the fact that Jesus was healing on the Sabbath and that He couldn't do such a thing because that was considered work. And John's point in telling us this is to let us know that some people just don't get the meaning of the Sabbath. They think it's all about a bunch of religious stuff that you do, but you still remain the center of your own universe. And you become the king or queen of your own little world. But Sabbath, as it's really to be practiced in the Christian faith, is to take ourselves less seriously and place Jesus on the throne of our life and look for God to do something special. And it's when we recognize that on a daily basis, but then specifically on a weekly basis, God does things and He shows up. John Phillips, you have a legal partner who wrote a book called Search for God in America, Hugh Hewitt. And he wrote it back in the 80s. And one of the things he talks about in the book is he talks about all these different people who have taken seriously a relationship with God and have gone on a search for God. And he was kind of a neighbor across town on the other side of the tracks from me, up in Thousand Oaks. And he came and spoke to a men's group at our church. And one of the things he said about the book that he wrote is, with all the people that he had talked to, liberal, conservative, old, young, Midwest, East Coast, South, West, North, wherever, all the people across America who went on a God search, all the people who took seriously looking for the God thing in their life, you know what they did? They found God. That's the basic thesis of his book. And it shows in every chapter that he writes. I have a friend who worked for Big Blue. You know Big Blue? IBM? And I was living in Thousand Oaks, and he was in the Bay Area, and he came to visit us. And the whole time he was with us, he would text on his phone because he had to respond to Big Blue. Big Blue needed him. And he was with us. He and his wife and kids were with us for 3 days. And he missed the joy of the children playing together. He missed watching the children surf on their little wakeboards. He missed some of the jokes that his wife and my wife and I shared together because he was responding to Big Blue, and he just missed it. He just wasn't taking a Sabbath. And I thought, how sad to go through life and not experience the joy that God has for us in the moment, isn't it? And yet I say that, and last Friday, that was supposed to be my day off, I go with my wife to the Getty Museum, and there I am, texting away. Ooh, got to talk to this person, got to respond to this email, better get back to them because, well, I'll be in trouble if I don't. Got to think about this, got to do that. And my wife kindly said, "Put it away, Davis." Isn't it wonderful to have wives that speak the word of God? She did. And it was a blessing. And when I was starting to sneak it out again, I came into a room at the Getty. I don't know if you know this painting. I forget the author, the painter's name, but he's from Brussels. And he paints this huge painting that takes up the whole wall, and it's called The Entry of Jesus into Brussels. Have you seen that one? And it's this carnival scene everywhere around, and Jesus is in the middle of it, and nobody even notices him. And how does that happen? But it does, as we keep texting on our phones or ignoring the God thing that's happening right around us. You know that movie I went to where I saw that amazing Coke ad? There was also a movie there by Kanye West. And it was kind of interesting because the movie was called Christ the King. Jesus the King, that's what it was called. Jesus the King. And it was Bible verse and gospel song. And Bible verse and gospel song, and Bible verse and gospel song, and no Kanye anywhere. You could tell his voice was at work, and maybe he was in the shadows. But for once, Kanye stepped out of the center of his universe and did something beautiful. And who knows? That might be a thing that takes him into his adult life of parenthood with Kim. But I tell you, it could just be a thing and a fling. But I think if it stays, it'll make a big difference for him. It'll give him a lot of joy, and it'll make a difference in the world around him. And if we do the same and open ourselves up to the reality of Jesus, and we sing his praise, and we really focus on him, then it's going to make a difference in our life, because we're talking about the real thing here. He opens our eyes so that we can see, if we open ourselves to him.